Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special episode of Ipsos Politics Talk. My name is Cameron Garrett, and with our very first Scottish Political Monitor out this week, we have a very exciting Scotland takeover. I'm joined by two of my wonderful colleagues from the Edinburgh office, Rachel Ormston and Emily Gray. Hello to you both.
Hi, Cameron. It's very nice to be here.
So, Emily, what do our latest numbers tell us about how the election is playing out in Scotland?
I think the immediate thing that jumps out from this poll is just how close the race looks now between Labour and the SNP in Scotland. So our Ipsos poll puts them both on 36% of the vote. But really important to note the direction of travel, because actually the momentum there has been with Labour, who are up 4 points compared with Ipsos' previous poll in January. So certainly the direction of travel has been Labour up, and then the SNP in recent months on the decline. But I think something that really stands out as well is that 42% of potential voters tell us that they might still change their mind. And of those two parties, it does look as though Labour may be better placed than the SNP to benefit from that, because the Conservative vote in Scotland looks softer than either the Labour or the SNP vote. And, of those currently Conservative voters, actually, they're much more likely to switch to Labour than they are to the SNP. And just to note on the Conservatives in Scotland, it's really not looking good. I mean, this poll was taken before Douglas Ross resigned as Conservative leader, or announced his intention to resign after the election. But just 13% of the vote, which really is not great compared with their performance back at the 2019 election.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe also worth saying that I think although the Conservatives have been in third place across the polls for quite a while in Scotland, they probably went into the election fairly confident in terms of, as long as they could keep that vote in the seats that they're targeting, that they would retain and maybe even add an MP or two in Scotland. But I guess, this is, I think, the lowest that we've had them for quite a while, and obviously it was taken before Douglas Ross decided he was going to resign after the election. So yeah, things definitely looking gloomier, I think, for the Conservatives in Scotland now. I think one thing that is worth saying, though, is that the Conservatives, in contrast with the position in the rest of the UK, don't appear to be losing particularly many votes to Reform in Scotland. So we had them on just 4% of the vote, so quite a bit lower than across the rest of the UK.
Yeah, and I think seats to watch come the general election really are those SNP and Conservative battlegrounds in Scotland. So particularly in the northeast of Scotland, but also the south of Scotland.
Yeah, and then in terms of the SNP Labour battlegrounds, much more across the central belt, and Lib Dems hoping to pick up a seat here and there in Fife and Dunbartonshire.
You say momentum's moving away from the SNP kind of towards Labour. Is that just are they hoovering up the unionist vote, or is that happening with independence voters as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think what we've seen really since Nicola Sturgeon resigned is the pattern that had been apparent for quite a few years, was that basically the SNP were extremely successful in getting the votes of almost everybody who supports independence. So they would, it was 90% plus of people who said they would vote yes if there was another referendum, also said they would vote SNP in whatever election you asked them about. That relationship has weakened considerably since Nicola Sturgeon resigned, and so what we're now seeing is that people who still support independence, and actually there's been no decline really in the polls in the level of support for independence. So we had it at 51% who said they'd vote yes if there was a referendum tomorrow, but they are much more willing to vote for other parties than they perhaps used to be.
And how do we expect tactical voting might feature in this election?
Do you want me to take that one, Emily?
Go for it.
So tactical voting does appear to be more of a feature this time round compared with 2019. So 2019, just before that election, we found that about 13% of people in Scotland said they would vote for a party that wasn't the party they really preferred, but that they thought would keep another party out in their constituency. This time around, that's gone up from 13% to 23%, so nearly a quarter of people saying that they plan to vote tactically. If you look at that by which party they say they plan to vote for at the moment, actually around a third of Labour's support comes from tactical voting, which is good for them in the short term. I think it might pose some worries for them come 2026 in terms of how soft or otherwise that 36% might be when it comes to the Scottish Parliament elections in a couple of years' time.
This election has kind of been sprung on Swinney and the SNP quite early into him becoming First Minister. What do the public think of him? Have they made their mind up yet? Has he had much of a honeymoon that we see some leaders have?
Yeah, I mean, he was less than 3 weeks into his time as First Minister. He was literally setting out his priorities for government on the day that the election was called. So I mean, look, none of the party leaders gets a positive approval rating from the public. I mean, the least worst are John Swinney and Anas Sarwar, but actually the Scottish public are really quite split, both on Swinney and Sarwar. But worth saying though that John Swinney is generally getting better approval ratings than Humza Yousaf did before him. So at least I think comfort for the SNP in that. But also just Rishi Sunak's ratings in Scotland really are dreadful. So his net approval rating is -64, and that is the worst that we have recorded at Ipsos Scotland for a Conservative Prime Minister during a general election campaign. Worse than Boris Johnson's back in 2019, which was -52. And then when it comes to Keir Starmer, the public are still fairly lukewarm on him, but when you look at who they think would make the most capable Prime Minister of Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, actually over half say that it would be Keir Starmer. So, although they may be lukewarm on him, nonetheless they do, a majority do see him as, capable and up to the job.
With my UK politics hat on, I don't think we've ever seen a satisfaction rating for any party leader below -60. I think the worst is Corbyn on -60 and Foot in the 80s on -60. So you've broken an Ipsos record there on -64 for Sunak.
Yeah, we have recorded worse for Boris Johnson.
We have.
Oh, okay, you have. Okay,
not during the 2019 election campaign, a bit later.
Yeah, Scottish people just more dissatisfied. Okay, and as the rest of the election plays out, what issues matter to Scotland voters? What should the parties be speaking about?
I mean, top of the list in terms of the issues that people say will be very important in influencing their vote is the NHS, so pretty similar to the UK as a whole on that front. I think the economy comes in second. Independence actually is third in the list, which is maybe a little higher than it has been in other recent ways. So having an election seems to focus people's attention a bit more on those questions in Scotland. But I think it's worth saying that in the run up to the 2021 election, I think I'm right in saying it was the top issue, and actually it's definitely not the top issue now. So I think that the public's focus seems to be much more on public services and the economy this time round, which will be good news for Anas Sarwar, who obviously wants to campaign in that area and avoid talking about the constitution where possible.
Okay, and looking to the rest of the campaign, what are you both looking out for in Scotland?
That's a good question. What we're looking out for? I think it will be interesting to see how much that on that question of independence, how much that actually does feature in how the parties sort of approach things. I mean, Douglas Ross certainly still likes to talk about independence quite a lot, even though he is opposed to it, because part of the Conservatives' narrative here has been that you need to vote Conservative to prevent independence. I'm not sure that argument works quite as well now that it looks very likely there's going to be a Labour government. John Swinney, it's kind of interesting to see how it's going to play into the SNP campaign. It's not totally clear to me that they're putting it front and centre at the moment, but that could change, because they could decide that that's one way of them trying to bring back some of the independent supporters who are currently minded to vote for other parties. So
I mean,
for me, it's interesting.
Yeah, and for me, it's worth watching the headline voting intention figures for Labour and the SNP across the range of polls really closely over the next 3 weeks before polling day, because of course in Scotland over a third of the seats at this election are marginal, and even quite small movements in vote share actually could make a big difference in terms of the number of seats that parties ultimately pick up. So there is still everything to play for the parties in Scotland. Whereas UK-wide, obviously, the gap is still looking much larger, with a 20-point lead for Labour in Ipsos's latest poll. But, let's see. A lot can happen in 3 weeks in politics.
Well, thank you both. That was fascinating. I certainly learned a lot, and I'll be looking out for more polling from the Scottish political team at Ipsos for the rest of the campaign. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron.